Thank you. Tell me when I've started. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is Queer and Trans Print Culture, and my name is Nick Boston. Thank you so much, Maggie. My name is Nick Boston. I'm an associate professor in Journalism and Media Studies Department at Lehman College here at the City University of New York. So we have a fantastic panel and great papers. I'm really excited. I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers and then we shall dive right in. Okay, so we have in the center of the table, we have Robert Cleary. Oh,
Sorry, there's no second out. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. No worries. Robert Cleary. And Robert is a PhD candidate in history at the CUNY Graduate Center here, and his dissertation explores developments in LGBTQ identities and consciousnesses through a study of the Gay Community News newspaper published weekly in Boston from 1973 to 1992. We also have at the end of the table, at the far end of the table, we have Audrey Silvestre. And Audrey, just give me a second here. A very long list. And Audrey Silvestre is an assistant professor of Latino studies at Northwestern University. She's an interdisciplinary scholar and community organizer from Southeast Los Angeles, California, obviously. And right beside me is JD Davids, and JD.
We should have gone in alphabetical order.
Well, I know that's why they put the program together. That certainly would have been very helpful here for alphabetical order. Okay, so JD Davids, him is a chronically ill and disabled transgender and queer writer with decades of work in world-changing social movements, policy advocacy, and journalism. And all of our speakers, as you know, their lengthier bios are online on the program, so please do, if you, and I'm sure you will, want to know more about their work, consult those. Okay, I'm going to ask Audrey to begin, right? Oh, wait, hang on. No. Who's to go first? No, Robert.
Sure.
Robert, please.
All right.
You have the floor. Thank you.
Is he good now? Is me to stand up?
I'm just no, you're gonna stand.
Okay. I think it'll be better for the webinar.
Okay. Exactly.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. When I proposed the subject of this paper to the CLAGS conference, I gave it to the title, The Working Class Queers of Gay Community News. In what follows, I discussed relationships between class and queerness in the context of GCN. The acronym, sorry, the Gay Community News, also known as GCN. In what follows, I discussed relationships between class and queerness in the context of GCN, yet the paper ended up going in unexpected directions so that the title no longer fully reflects or fits the essay, as you'll no doubt observe, but just as a fair warning. So I recently started playing with the idea of class consciousness in my thinking. And specifically, partly with this conference in mind, and specifically with this idea of what I am calling a queer class consciousness. As far as I'm aware, this is not a concept that has been widely used or described. Of course, we know that there's nothing new under the sun, and so it's entirely possible someone has developed or used this concept already. I did find a couple of sort of popular cultural references in a general internet search, but I wanted to use this space to begin laying out some of my thinking on the subject as I'm developing it. So the idea of consciousness in itself is somewhat slippery. Consciousness is such a broad and important idea that it can do a massive amount of work for historians, yet it is so hard to really pin down that it can be difficult to precisely show the work that it is doing. As used to describe, so just generally speaking, what is consciousness, right? As used to describe that aspect of the mind which is not reducible to mechanical functions, it remains more of a mystery than not. As used in reference to a particular situated perspective, it can refer both to what Patricia Hill Collins describes as the private personal space of an individual and what Collins also describes as a group-based consciousness emerging through developing oppositional knowledges. So that it is operating simultaneously both on the individual and the collective, sometimes in some descriptions independently and other times always interactively, right, on these two levels. The idea of consciousness is crucial to historical inquiry, yet its definition can be so manifold and uncertain as to defy the precision that we seek in our historical arguments. So that in speaking as examples of feminist consciousness, of race consciousness, of certain political consciousnesses, it is the case both that we may be referring to something which exists either on an individual or a collective level, and equally that we may be referring to a thing which is, I said, this is sort of the complicatedness of it, which is either both simultaneously, individual or collective, or which is distinct, and yet both of which requires the other to come into historical being. So there is, of course, amongst these many ideas of consciousness, before we even get to what is a class consciousness, right, never mind a queer class consciousness, there is, of course, W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of a double consciousness, which Paul Gilroy describes as this doubleness, quote, this doubleness, what Richard Wright calls the dreadful objectivity, which follows from being both inside and outside. That is Paul Gilroy in There Ain't No Black in Union Jack, his book. So that the promiscuity of consciousness as a tool and an idea is evident even before we come to the idea of the specific idea of class consciousness. So how did I come? So this is sort of a thinking piece, right? So how did I come to the idea of class consciousness? That's really what I'm sort of organizing these remarks, the lines along which I'm organizing these remarks. I began with the idea of anger, of rage. This is something I sort of started thinking about maybe in the past few years as an essential aspect of a truly revolutionary movement, a kind of existential anger or rage, which is rooted most commonly in interlocking sets of imposed material conditions. So that's an important idea that, like, the class aspect, this is the material aspect as opposed to the more metaphysical understandings of consciousness. So this led me, this conceptualizing of the importance of anger, materially based anger in social movements and revolutionary movements, led me to a material conception of queers as a class of people, right? Defined by their material conditions and their relations to social production. There are different kinds of queer dispossession. It can be, and often is, of a material nature, which is my focus here, yet there's also social and even psychic dispossession, akin perhaps in ways to the idea of double consciousness put forward by Du Bois. This is an idea I'm still thinking about and which I hope to develop in later work. I am interested less in queers, and this is where, like, the evolution of the paper from the proposal that I made originally to the conference, I am less interested, as it turns out, in queers who happen to be working class, although there are important and overlapping points of connection there, and more in this idea of queerness itself under certain prevailing historical conditions as being a kind of class position. What makes it a class position, in large part, is its materiality. So we have along similar lines, right? We have the feminist thought developed in the 1960s, thank you, feminists thought developed the idea of sex class, right, which was first laid out by Shulamith Firestone in her book, The Dialectic of Sex. There was a tremendous influence of Marxism on feminist thought, including Firestone, right? And a rich engagement of feminist thought with Marxist ideas. And this is not to say that queer history and theory have not been influenced and informed by Marxist ideas and analysis. And yet, I think what I'm finding is that the literature on feminism and histories of women is more expansive than the literature on gay and lesbian and queer histories. And there's a lot of influence and interaction you see in feminist literature and women's history around Marxism that I think queer studies and queer history can do well to look to more closely. A little disjointed, but that's okay. My first exposure to the idea of class consciousness came a couple decades ago, studying Marx and just I wasn't in college, I was politically active and we read Karl Marx. And I'm just saying, I say that because it was available to me as an idea, right? As I'm reading this stuff, I'm like, it kind of like, and so it's interesting how it's kind of, I feel like I'm overlapping frameworks as I'm reading closely through these texts. A couple of them so now we're on to class consciousness, how I got to it. I got to it, the idea was in my in my vocabulary, and as I'm reading, it overlaid itself on the text that I was engaging with and my thinking about those texts. So a couple of the major, so then I started to look into it because the idea is, it's not something I really thought about a lot in a long time. So I thought I had to go back to, well, what is class consciousness? How has it been defined? Two of the major thinkers on the question of class consciousness have been E.P. Thompson and I'm going to say his name, I'm not going to pronounce his name well, George Lukács. And according to Lukács, class consciousness is neither the sum nor the average of what is thought or felt by the single individuals who make up the class, and yet the historically significant actions of the class as a whole are determined in the last resort by this consciousness and not by the thought of the individual. And those actions can be understood only by reference to this consciousness. And that maybe is not, as my advisor said one time, as clear as mud. However, although not in reference to George Lukács, I find it, however, I think that I find this idea of class consciousness so useful, largely or in part because of the complicated nature of the idea within Marxian thought, its open-endedness, right? This is both in its development. I don't think it has not necessarily been fully developed, right? Like it is an idea that still requires unpacking and there's work to be done. But also in its very nature, right? In the same way that consciousness is very difficult to locate, right? It's both located in these specific material conditions, but also in the interaction of individuals within those conditions, but then also with each other in that, right? So that brings us to gay community news. So this is my framework for understanding gay community news. Because I argue that a queer class consciousness is visible in the early issues of Gay Community News, of the Gay Community News newspaper, hereafter GCN. GCN was founded in Boston in the summer of 1973 by a ragtag collection of queers in a back room of the Charles Street Meeting House. This is the Charles Street Meeting House. The window is off the screen, but that's the door to the back room. On the flat part of Beacon Hill along halfway between Charles Street and the Boston Common and Public Gardens. I have more to say about its founding, but it's not in this brief paper. So I'm interested. So as we look, so these are just some. This is it evolved over time. These are just fun images, so you have something to look at besides me as I'm talking. I don't know how to make this. No. Sorry. I got it. Okay. Is it like the arrow? No. Oops. Thank you. Oh, okay. So yeah, a ragtag collection of queers, some of the influences of on the work. Thank you. What did I do? Okay, thank you so much. So I'm interested in thinking, so there's through the gender dynamic, now gender dynamics in part. So I was brought to like the feminist literature on the question in part because GCN was like a cross, was a cross-gendered group of folks, right? It was not exclusively homosocial, which many organizations at the time actually were. And so I'm very interested in thinking through how the gender dynamics of the queer community at the time, and which are very observable playing out weekly in the pages of GCN, may be better understood by seeing them through the lens of class. And again, not like working class as next to or in contradiction to bourgeoisie or middle class kind of, although that's in there, but this like conception of a specifically like queerly classed group of folks. And so, sorry, not only through the lens of such traditional classes as the working class and bourgeoisie, but more in terms of an underclass, right? Perhaps reaching towards the idea of an undercommons as developed by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. As any other class, a queer class would be formed through material conditions, through being a part of a group that stands in a certain kind of relation to social labor processes. So this is sort of getting to the center of my argument, which I'm still developing. So alongside, there's a number of influences on gay and lesbian liberation, right? And among them are the New Left, feminist, and civil rights movements. There are also earlier traditions of queer political organizing, the homophile movement, and even earlier, right? And alongside these, there is visible the influence of earlier material queer cultures. What I'm referring to as material queer cultures. This is what's written about by George Chauncey in Gay New York, by Nan Amelia Boyd in Wide Open Town, and amongst other works by other authors that are equally significant. They're not strictly political, right? But and that these are becoming, they're engines driving the liberation movement and the politicization of the late 1960s and early 1970s. So none of this is new, right? Like the ideas that I'm working with, for the most part, are not in any way original, and many are quite long-standing. My contribution is to try and to be able to show this playing out in real time in the pages of Gay Community News. Or another way of saying it, that reading GCN alongside both other publications of the period and contemporary and later theoretical and historical works brings out the theory that was being developed in the pages of GCN. And I owe some credit there to Professor Orasanmi Burton, author of the book Tip of the Spear, who spoke at the history program a couple of weeks ago and was talking about taking incarcerated folks, sort of taking their theorizing as like in seriously as theoretical work. And so, you know, it's interesting to, I'm looking at some of the very quotidian, I think is the word, everyday kinds of stuff that's in here. Letters to the editor, thank you. Advertisements, personal ads, and reading these, you know, as like developing queer theory before people had really started to talk about queer theory in explicit terms. So that I've lost track. Here we are. Okay, so I'm gonna wrap up here with so just to say, the reach and the influence of Gay Community News is actually hard to overestimate. It was massively influential, right? And sort of everybody was reading it. I mean, and the number of people who were involved in it and who those people were over a period of time is like quite remarkable too. But it was also a collective, and it was very open. It was like it was a wide mixture of folks from around the community. So I'm looking at these early issues, right? And the first two letters to the editor appear in the second issue of Gay Community News. One of them is from Charlie Shively, who was a queer activist and editor of the journal Fag Rag. And that letter is a little bit more, it needs more unpacking in them. So I decided not to include it, which is just as well, for time purposes, the reasons of time. But the other is from Ellen B. Davis, which you see here. who was an early worker at GCN, a member of the collective, and its first longstanding news editor. And here Ellen Davis is. Now, I cannot yet show that this is Ellen Davis as well. A lot of the stuff in the newspaper was not, there was no bylines, right? But this is Ellen, and there's a later that Ellen is expressing this, I should probably stick to my script, but is expressing this very inclusive sense of like gayness that was one of the things happening at the time. So the two letters illustrate the influence of at several of what I've meant the feminist, new left, civil rights, and earlier queer homophile political organizing, and the queer material culture. All of these are actually represented in different ways in these two letters. Shively's letter, which you're not looking at, aligns itself with the actions of lesbian feminist Jean O'Leary in her attack on Sylvia Rivera at the Christopher Street Liberation Day the week before, right? So Shively's, and he's getting, and his influences are very much like new left lesbian feminist, but also he's in his other writings, you see this queer material culture really like driving a lot of his actions. So he's somebody I'll spend more time with later in further work that I do. Ellen Davis's letter celebrates the close connectedness between all queers, right? It's a little bit utopian, perhaps, but I'm taking it seriously, right? And I'm taking Davis very seriously. So I see in Davis's letter a different influence, right? And this is what I'm after. This is what I want to understand better. Where was Ellen B. Davis coming from? It was like a sea change. It was like this. It was a life-altering experience, and I think that there's a lot to be gotten at there. So that I see two distinct forms of. I'll skip over that. So just to wrap up, given how many options lesbians and gay women had in Boston and Cambridge to work for feminist, lesbian, and gay liberation without having to work with men at all, and given the tons of critical reasons why there were so many options to not have to work with men, right? What brought some lesbians and gay men to work together? And I do think there's more than one answer to this question, and I think it probably depends on the class position of the people involved. I see three distinct axes around which lesbian, gay, and trans queers work together. The first is sort of the first and third are like distinct class consciousness, there's like National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, like relatively middle class bourgeois, like these folks could work together towards, and then like in the middle you have like political consciousnesses, like the new left. These folks could collaborate because they had these like larger frameworks of political consciousness, and then the third is this is what I suggest is a shared material historical consciousness, what I am calling a queer class consciousness. And it's interesting, and I'll wrap up here, this material historical culture would have been different for lesbian, gay, and trans queers, yet I'm hoping to show in my work that there are shared elements which are roots of gay liberation and its later iterations, and I do think that I have evidence for this in the gay community news. Thank you.
Thank you. Audrey, please.
Audrey, you.
Thanks, Robert. That was great. Thank you. Really good. Thank you.
Just.
I was super. Okay, so that's one more. I love you to put that. There you go. Yeah. Okay.
So I wrote for the New York equivalent. Well, it's much newer in terms of the timeline, but also here in New York.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's been great. It comes up. There's other cities too, and globally. It's like
yeah, it's a whole thing.
Okay, good morning. My name's Audrey Silvestre,
And the presentation of my paper, Scutter and the Politics of Punk Mentorship, Building Brown Working Class Queer Futures Through DIY Networks. So in the late 1990s, Rudy Garcia, a queer Latino punk from East Los Angeles, who was not yet 21, stood outside Club Scutter in Los Angeles, California, a party hosted by Vaginal Cream Davis. So Davis came outside and asked him, "What are you doing here?" And Garcia replied, "I'm listening to music," and shared his scene Scutter. Davis invited him to return early the following week and say that he was there to interview her so he would be let in. So that moment that's improvised, informal, and generous, marks what this paper understands as queer punk mentorship in practice. And I define mentorship here not as formal guidance, but as but as a set of ongoing relational practices through which knowledge, access, and working class strategies are transmitted across difference. Okay, so this paper argues that Scutter DIY zine produced by Garcia in the early 2000s is not just a cultural artifact, but a relational archive of working class brown people's queer mentorship with working class punks. So over time, Scutter expanded beyond the scene format, later becoming a festival and a record label, and in that way expanding its role as a platform for community building and cultural production. So just to also situate a little bit of the context, right? The late 1990s and early 2000s were a period marked by devastating loss of HIV/AIDS, crisis, as well as a intensifying anti-immigrant propositions in California, targeting undocumented communities, so Prop 187 and Prop 202, for example. So Scutter documents networks of care forged under conditions of precarity. The scene, as Vaginal Davis described it, quote unquote, the most fabulous gay magazine in Los Angeles. So the scene reflects both aesthetic innovation and survival practice. And crucially, Scutter served as a catalyst for Garcia's mentorship relationships with Vaginal Davis and Martin Sorodenki, who I will talk about next, positioning the scene itself as an entry point into intergenerational exchange. So through these relationships, Scutter reveals again how mentorship operates as a form of survival infrastructure, and again transmitting not only knowledge but also tactics for navigating economic stability, informal economies, and institutional exclusion. And drawing on Jose Muñoz's concept of queer world making, I frame these relationships as producing alternative modes of belonging that exceed both mainstream queer visibility and punk subcultural norms, and grounded in the conditions of working class life. So Muñoz, so a little bit more about Muñoz. So Muñoz described, sorry, this like repeated. Okay, so for Garcia, mentorship is not institutional. It happened in clubs, cars, diners, and letters, and in living rooms. It is inconsistent and deeply shaped by race, class, and also the geography of Los Angeles. And so what may appear as fragmented or DIY practices is more precisely response to the limited access to capital archives and that Garcia had to institutions as somebody who didn't complete college. And most of the people who he organizes also didn't, have college degrees. So just a little bit about Vaginal Davis. I feel most people are familiar with her, but if not, before Club Scutter, Davis was already a foundational figure in queer underground culture through projects like Cholita, PME, to name a few. There's like so much, right? And so these projects blended racial satire, punks, aesthetics, and queer performance in ways that challenge both white punk scenes and normative gay culture. So by the time Garcia meets her, Davis is not just a performer, she is an archive of subcultural history. And yet Garcia initially encounters her without that full context. He knows she's important, but not why. And this gap matters. This is not incidental, as it reflects the uneven transmission of cultural memory in working class communities of color, highlighting how working class queer youth of color often encounter their own cultural histories how their own cultural histories are informal, ephemeral, or inaccessible. So Davis' mentorship begins not with explanation, but with recognition. She facilitates Garcia's entry into Club Scutter despite him being underage. instructing him how to navigate the door. And she introduces him to other artists, performers, celebrities, already making him feel like he belongs. So here's a little long quote. So Garcia would share, I would see her out and she would tell people I wrote this magazine. I don't even know if she ever read it. And she would just kind of like be super supportive. I would always see her at shows and she would say hi to me. Even if she was like with quote unquote celebrities, she would introduce me to everyone. She always encouraged me and pushed me. And she would call me sometimes. And I lived with my parents and she would say, oh, I'm just watching novellas. And she would say to my mom, it's Miss Davis. Which a Latina mom answering the phone to vaginal days, that's why. This mentorship is what we might call a prefigurative belonging. She positions him within a world before he has the resources to claim it. And at that time, Davis models the labor behind performance and how to value one's labor. Her expectations were rides, meals, and a dressing room, which these requests initially confused Garcia. And over time, he came to understand them as delivered. These are not, micro sort of like, these are not just things that she's requesting to be kind of like quote unquote a diva, right? But rather micro negotiations within precarious cultural economies where queer performers of color are often underpaid, overextended, and expected to work for exposure. So mentorship here includes learning how to set terms, refuse exploitation, and recognize one's worth within informal economies. And so this type of mentorship also includes teaching how to demand conditions of care. Their interactions driving to Los Angeles, eating at Denny's, visiting museums, form what we might think as an embodied pedagogy, where knowledge is transmitted through time, mobility, proximity, rather than formal instruction. So Davis also sustains, after sort of Davis moves to Berlin, sustains a relationship through letters, postcards, and public affirmations. And these gestures are not incidental. They're part of how networks are built and maintained outside traditional institutions. So if Davis teaches recognition and access, Martin Sororengui offers political articulation. As a member of Los Crudos and later Limpers, Sororengui is central to articulating a specifically queer Latino hardcore punk politic. Yet Garcia's relationship to the scene is initially ambivalent. He distanced himself from the local punk scene due to the pervasive masculinity, hypermasculinity and homophobia often linked to hardcore punk. He recalls feeling pressured to present himself as more conventionally masculine in order to avoid being targeted. And so Garcia's relationality to Sororengui changes when he watches the documentary Más allá de los gritos. He writes a long letter to Sororengui, which results in Garcia receiving a copy of the documentary. And so Garcia shares, it was the same thing as Riot Girl for me. It was a scene that was like, oh shit. When I saw the documentary, I was like, duh, I care about all these things and passionate about these things. Me and my friends have had conversations about all these propositions that were happening in the 90s and being frustrated by it. But I didn't really honestly connect it to my local music scene. And that was kind of my ignorance, But seeing his passion for us having our voices heard in punk and staking our claim in punk, those planted seeds in me, the way I went about my band and stuff. I think that his attitude about not giving a fuck and going out there and pushing boundaries and getting shit done. So this moment is not simply a personal awakening, but it reflects broader conditions, the absence, again, of accessible archives for brown queer subcultures, which produces a sense of disconnection even within one's own community. What changes is not just Garcia's musical taste, but his framework. In subcultural terms, he acquires a form of capital, but one that is racialized, politicized, and rooted in recognition rather than exclusion. So their relationship of mentorship and trust developed through letters, similar to Davis, then collaboration. So Sororengui participates in the Scutter festival. He then asked Garcia to book his band Libris for their first show on the West Coast, and asked Garcia's $3 band named $3 Puta to perform. So the show itself, brought together drag performances, hardcore punk, exemplifies a restructuring of subcultural spaces, challenging again the whiteness and the heteromasculinity often associated with these spaces, while expanding what queer performance can look like. And so beyond performance, Sotodengi models the practical dimensions of sustaining creative life under economic constraint. So navigating collective conflict, knowing when to move on for projects, and managing debt and financial stability. And so Garcia's reflections on these conversations point to an often overlooked dimension of mentorship, which is the transmission of survival knowledge, including how to endure, adapt, and continue, as there's not a lot of financial literacy anywhere, but for poor people less. So taken together, these relationships show that mentorship in queer working class communities of color is not supplemental, it is structural. In the absence of institutional support, Garcia relies on networks that provide access to space, introductions to networks, political frameworks, strategies for navigating, again, informal and precarious economies. So although Garcia started Scutter as a scene to document his fandom, what ensued instead was the bringing people into relations, solidifying connections, and circulating knowledge. And this is particularly significant given how dominant queer historiographies often, again, overlook or marginalize working class brown cultural production. Mentorship networks like these remain underdocumented, not because they are rare, but because they operate outside recognized institutions. So in centering mentorship, this paper argues that Scutter reveals how queer brown punks in Los Angeles build worlds, not just through expression, but through infrastructure. Vaginal Davis teaches Garcia that he belongs, while also modeling how to, again, demand value and to demand care. And so then he teaches him how to translate that belonging into political and collective practice. Together, they demonstrate that for working class people of color, mentorship is not optional. It is a means of accessing culture, surviving, and building alternative worlds. Garcia would go on to continue to write and make scenes and become a producer, curator, DJ, musician, and a great friend of mine. So for over 20 years, he has organized events with parties such as Spunk, Boya Loca, and Scum. He also did some curatorial work, including exhibits for the Charlie James Gallery and the Armory in Pasadena, California. And Garcia was also the member and co-founder of the Maricon Collective and producer of DragCon LA and New York in its inaugural years. So at a moment when queer culture is increasingly institutionalized, but also defunded, archived, monetized, but also again defunded, Garcia reminds us that many of these worlds were and continue to be built through informal, relational, and class practices that remain largely invisible to dominant histories. Thank you, and sorry, I sped through that.
Wow.
I have 2 times of coffee.
You still have time if you really need to notes. You
Um,
still have like 5 minutes, actually.
I guess just,
Yeah.
I don't know how to go back, but that's fine. Just to add a little bit more about, I think, because I cut out because I was like over time, is that Garcia, as he developed his friendship with Sotodengi, they eventually started talking about finances. And Sotodengi was like, look, girl, you need to get your finances in order, and not like in like capitalism, like build like this like billionaire, right, wealth, but more like how are you gonna retire? How are you gonna do these things, right? And so and that's something Garcia hadn't thought about because he was like, I just come from working class, upbringing. Both of his parents migrated to the US from Mexico, and so it's about survival, right? When you're sort of in that type of environment, and so speaking to Sotodengi about like, okay, this is how you pay off your credit card and like the importance of doing that, right? This is how you save. This is how you do these things. Like that was really valuable for him, and also because again, thinking about the time when Garcia kind of grew up was like he was in high school like in the late 90s, and he recalls 2 things. One, being afraid of like hooking up because of HIV/AIDS, but also kind of like as he grew up, not having a lot of mentorship around him, around like what it meant to be queer Latino. And so building these relationships, I think just sort of like really shifted not only how he organized, but just like his own just development as a person, and making sure that he's like, has savings, which are helpful. So yeah. I'll leave it at it. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Audrey. Thank you.
Okay, I can get those slides up.
Okay, and can this be here or it doesn't read?
Let me see.
Or maybe I could do it like,
Yeah.
because I have them up here, but
The piano player.
yeah, like the guy with the two keyboards.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that dovetails nicely with the last presentation, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I'll just start out by saying these are the prettiest slides I've ever made. So thank you for the opportunity to try to redeem my history of awful, awful slides. And I'd like to thank Dr. Anbach, who I started this work in her awesome class last semester. Quick switch.
This one?
Yes,
Alright.
look at that, huh? This is the one of the more prevalent current covers of Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which is a very well-known work by Samuel R. Delaney, in which he looks at the disruption, the community and the culture of people who are going to the porn theaters, queer men, gay men, straight men in the porn theaters, that was disrupted by Giuliani and the zoning that destroyed that area. And this is sort of an homage to that, that looks at my interviews with 6 people who identify as transmasculine, transmale, or non-binary, who do or did engage in cruising for public sex, and it's dedicated to Ross Thomas and Cecilia Gentili. In the book, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, Delaney talks about a paraplum, which is a description of a coastline as it actually appears to the deck of a small ship, what a sailor can see after a storm of the land they are passing. So today is a paraplum of tributes in which 6 trans and non-binary navigators and 1 curious, cranky, queer sex god capstone writer, that's me, reporting from the cruising coastlines of late 2025. So there's 2 scaffolds for this work. One is Delaney's work, where he talks about contact versus networking. Networking is same class and goal directed, and contact is cross-class, cross-race, and in the case of my work here, cross-gender. It depends on shared infrastructure because because we have class divides, people won't ordinarily meet up. And I'm actually thinking of using this as a frame for work I'm doing on the true origins of the Dyke March, which I don't have time to talk about now. So Giuliani era demolition destabilized, destroyed, and scattered the infrastructure of contact. Berlant and Warner in 1998, so similar timing, talked about counter-public word making. Queer culture builds counter-publics, or maybe classes, intimacies with no necessary relation to the couple form, family, or property. And they talk about the impact of the 1995 zoning law in New York City would fall unequally on those who already have the fewest publicly accessible resources. I just went to the Netherlands where I'm moving and I lost my glasses. So I'm talking about infrastructures of contact. So here we have is the 42nd Street Theater in the era that Delaney was writing about. It's all year round, it's weather protected, predictable hours, it's easy to get to on the subway, multiple lines, it's low cost, not free, and it facilitates cross-class, cross-race mixing and was destroyed and dispersed by the zoning. Plum Beach, a place I frequent, it has kind of seasonal migration of cruising. It's weather exposed, it has limited hours because if you're driving and it's hard to get to by public transportation, the lot now is closed at 9 p.m. Far from public transit. It's free, it's part of a federal park. The dunes are eroding, and I'm working on a comic book that talks about the erosion and other forms of loss. And one of the things that happen in the parking lot is car play. So if you have a car, if it's not your car, you don't have as much control over what happens in or around the cars. The infrastructure is eroding, but it's still in use. And then the Vale of Kashmir in Prospect Park is what contact still could be. It's pretty easy to get to. It's in near public transit and in a residential community. so it can facilitate cross-race and class mixing, but it's slated for a $40 million redevelopment that's going to destroy all that. So, so here's a QR code if you'd like to take out your phone. If you'd like to be in a signal chat to try to fight against the destruction of the Vale of Kashmir. So in my work, and here's a bit about my call for narrators. I said I was seeking to interview transmasculine or non-binary people who cruise or cruise for public sex. And so notably I said, because, you know, one thing that has been more prevalent to a small degree since the late 90s is there are some sex parties that are either open to trans people participating or particularly feature us or sort of promote us being there or center us. So I said that this is for trans people who have or currently engage in public sex cruising beyond not specifically at trans welcoming sex parties, because I wanted to see what was happening outside of the scope of what's sort of trying to manage this for us, what's sort of happening out in the wild, right? And I distributed through personal networks, through the Trans Professional Association for Transgender Health, and my fellow faculty of the Sexual Liberation Track of the Creating Change annual conference sponsored by the LGBT Task Force. Because this inquiry is part of my biography memoir project, which is memoir writing and not research, it was not put through an IRB. It's not research, it's research in terms of writing research or journalistic research. So I actually have 7 navigators. What happened to E? I'm not really sure. I think it has to do with like time, like something happened to my campus sponsored Otter account, but so hopefully E will be emerged. But I have here a description of each in their own words. And, you know, considering this was sort of like a convenience or snowball sample, I had a really pretty diverse array of people. Different ages, different racial identification, class identification, locations, body ability or disability, and ethnicity. And I did have one person who I'll talk, it keeps forwarding itself. One person I'll talk about who was like, oh, I'm genderqueer. And I was like, but aren't you AMAB? And they were like, yeah, but I'm genderqueer. I was like, okay, come on in. And in fact, his experiences, I think, are very important as part of the work. So one of the things that came up a lot is what's mapped on trans masked people, and I'm saying that as a shorthand for the different identities that people had, by cis cruising partners from the straight world. So respondent A said, I might be like a gateway drug, so to speak, towards homosexuality, like I'm the safest option. C said, a hybrid being. A lot of times there were men that were straighter than I thought they were. They treated me as best as some kind of hybrid being. Is there a way to make it stop forwarding itself? I'll just keep going back otherwise. And then my cranky queer suspicion and experience is that for some people, we're sort of.
I think it might be because you perhaps you're resting your hand on the.
I'm not. Oh, on this. Okay, yeah. Okay. Sorry. I'm a math guy. Yeah, so my suspicion and experience is for some men, cis men, we're the right hole in the right location because cis women aren't allowed to cruise, really. You know, so if you're going to go out there and get some quick, easy, free public sex, here's what there is. And some of the excitement might be that you get someone who, like, you know, physiologically is something you're either familiar with or want. And then there's also the sort of spectrum of fetishization to genuine appreciation, or you know, then now and then there's definitely people who are transmasculine who cruise in ways that don't allow others to know they're trans. There's obviously ways of doing that, though. The title of my talk, Packing Red, Packing Blue, is actually a bit of an irony because I was pretty sure that no one was going to say that they like packed a dildo when they went out cruising for public sex, and no one did. And I'll get more to like clothing and tools in a second, but it's more like sort of, you know, what are we packing in terms of safety, in terms of identity, but I thought it probably wasn't going to be that. So Dee's experience, I was glad that they were part of it because they're one that, you know, I think to some degree, the experience of many trans masculine people in cruising is intertwined with the HIV economy, including the advent of PrEP. Which gives a measure of sort of, you know, safety for HIV prevention that allows to have sex that's safer without talking. So in my experience, the experience of a lot of people I know who are transmasculine, getting on PrEP was a way to enter what was perceived as either a gay or, anonymous cruising world. It was a tool that people can essentially pack in order to access these worlds. But in Dee's experience, he was working in the bathhouses and then would go as a paying client. So he had sort of a class relationship that he felt was a little bit edgy and dangerous for him, but allowed him to know what were the best lockers and these are the people you shouldn't talk to about your gender identity. Where to cruise. They definitely had a class analysis. If this is a space of capital, if it is, this is not a space I feel comfortable cruising. So they preferred places that were more public, in which they included the bathhouses, more public feeling, which feels more public and less capitalist, even though they're there to make money. It just seems more open to sexual expression. I feel like we're living in the future, but we're not, they said, in relation to how few people know, for example, about injectable PrEP. It's the broke future where there's all these resources and benefits that only certain people know even exist. And then they were one of the people in the study who talked about sort of explicitly recognizing that public cruising can lead to having sex with people who are politically odious. And said, my public partners compared to my regular life sex partners are more conservative. They're married, they have kids, they're on the DL or down low, not download. They're actual Republicans, like Trump loving Republicans. C spoke about, I think there's sort of a class of aspect in this cruising that's very gendered, in which transmasculine people are feminized as by the cis male partners. He got us a hotel room. I stayed the night and had a continental breakfast after he went to work. He bought us dinner. He was funding it. And I was like, I'm just trying to get cracked and leave. It felt like I was taking advantage of my femininity to exist in these roles that these women to be in, which society necessitates that they spend money. So the cis man has the hospitality gendered script and puts the trans person in it. The queer counter public, as laid out in the earlier, theoretical work, is not always counter heteronormative in the experience of these people. Respondent A talks about communications and class in the bathhouse, in that the structure is you can purchase a bed for an upcharge, and it creates a situation where people will go to a place to find people to fuck, but then they fuck behind doors, which to me is just rude. And then most of the people I'm having sex with don't have the intellectual capacity to go into these topics with me, which is an interesting. A grew up poor and working class, and just doesn't perceive that there's sort of like intellectual or cultural community between the people they're seeing on cruising. But then they're sort of expected to take in communication and do emotional labor. They feel safe and vulnerable, and they want to tell me about their shitty lives, how lonely they are. So very hard to toe that line of going there for what I want without doing emotional labor that would exhaust me, which again, I think is fairly gendered. C talks about sort of like a class ascension that has to do with drag culture. As I grew in the drag scene, I don't have to go out of the way whatsoever to find people who want to fuck me. I can find people maybe who are all trans themselves or definitely understand my body, but then also think it's a privilege to have access to me in a way that cruising doesn't make possible because you don't know the person. So they felt more like tolerated or anonymized, fetished in the cruising market. In the drag scene market, they're chosen for a trans body. They're known, and access is treated as a privilege. G spoke about what disappeared, the infrastructure that gentrification took, which brings us back to the earlier work. There aren't many private places that are uninhabited. Hotels are very expensive. This is one of the person who even lived more rurally is saying this. There's fewer abandoned fire towers and water towers. There's fewer abandoned buildings. There's fewer uninhabited alleys and industrial areas. The woods are patrolled by a bunch of women with their strollers and baby dolls. To host, you have to have a private room. Your roommates have to be okay with having people over. So the free or marginal infrastructure that cruising depends on has been patrolled and populated out of existence. So the comment that most, sort of specifically sort of conformed with what Delaney was talking about, F, who lives in the Pine Barrens outside Philly, it's very nice, said, draws differences between the anonymous cruising partners. By the way they look, I can tell they're more blue collar or like more tradesmen, and non-anonymous friends and lovers. Most of my friends are white collar workers. A lot of them are in tech. The cruising trail is where the class grind is caused, where the contact is happening. The friend circle is where it is held and where one presumes there would be networking. For example, if someone needs a job or a place to live. The next section, how much time do I have left?
You have 6 minutes.
Great. Trans labor as cruising infrastructure. I've got a lot on this. The labor of producing a cruising encounter. There's more labor done on the part of trans folks. D talks about gender management. And in fact, even though they, are assigned male at birth, they are making people, basically what I saw is that people kind of are sliding up and down a perceived gender binary for issues of sort of access to sex and for safety, even though in their sort of real lives or other lives, they hold complexities of gender that are not binary. So in this case, he changes his voice texture and I should say they change their change their voice texture and don't correct misgendering. In every other part of my life, I'm an asshole about that and stand up for myself, but there I just look the other way. They always wear women's pants, but they don't wear the Donna Karens that look more feminine in these situations. But they also bring a safety kit, lube, water, gun, gum, battery pack, pepper spray or a whistle, sometimes a knife. They share a location with a beloved person. A deliberately strives for legibility. I want to make it extremely clear what my body is and what it's capable of, and to make it as easy as possible for the people around me. In this case, they thong to show no penis and I'm here to bottom. A collar flagging submission. A bodysuit showing top surgery scars. Thank you. I definitely present masculine in most places in the United States when I'm traveling, when I'm not feeling comfortable. C tapes down their nipples. Certain guys would be noticeably disappointed that my nipples were tucked away, almost like I revoked access to my boobs. There's a sense of entitlement. I was like, nope, I'm taped, almost forcing them to really perceive the fact that I'm a guy. And they talk about, based on the performance or what the guy is going for, they can tell if they've been with a trans guy before, based on whether they went down on me. F talks about clothing as protection from surfaces in the bathhouse. Or if it's summertime, I may not wear shorts because I'm going to be down on my knees. I don't want my bare knees on a bathroom floor or in the dirt. B, who's one of the two participants who identified as having been a sex worker, was more improvised and keyed by mood. Largely, I don't prepare, but there's times that I do. I have a little bag, lube, gloves, condoms, and really sort of cherishes being able to use eye contact and nonverbal communication as a primary infrastructure of this kind of cruising. And said, I feel much safer and much more comfortable with someone that could be a stranger in a public space. If I need to walk away, I can. And so the stakes of cruising and what may seem like a good place for contact may actually differ for trans people or people who are maybe more marginalized within more, cis gay spaces. G says, I just show up the same. Most of it's been pretty situational. I use condoms. When I was more femme presenting, I would wear a skirt because that made things easier, kind of, structurally. And now that I'm more mass presenting, it is challenging. So quickly, lastly, what is eroding cruising? People talked about different things, the political climate, 2 Trump eras, gentrification, police stings on sniffies, the badge after the blowjob fear, and the demographic shift, Trump-loving Republicans. So just to remind us, the right to the city extends to those who use the city. It's not limited to property owners. The loss of cruising spaces is real loss for all of us. It's loss of possibility, even if we ourselves don't use them. On a personal note, I'm in my work here at the grad center, I'm writing a lot about my dreams. And I often dream I go to the basement of a hotel or an airport or a train station. And I realize I found the bathhouse, the sex club, the sex spa. It feels great. And usually the dream ends there. What does that say, Don? 2. Oh, and usually the dream ends there, but it doesn't feel bad that I don't get to go in. The good feeling is that I could have access. And I've had a lot of these dreams. So I just want to say thank you, especially to the narrators and to Dr. Bob. And you can find me at my grad center email or at the Cranky Queer. And I look forward to, pursuing this work.
Okay, so fantastic papers. Thank you to our three presenters. We've got, you guys were amazing in terms of timing, just like on point. We've got 12 minutes. Please, we welcome questions for our presenters. Okay, I'll start it off. In terms of methodology, maybe each of you would like to talk about it. Fantastic. Everything will fantastic size, but you up the ante. Yes, please, go ahead. Whoever wants to take it. And go.
Oh, okay, well, because I did talk about that this was spurred by a course in oral history that actually Robert and I were both in. So I knew I was interested in this topic, and then I wanted to talk to people about it. And I knew I didn't want to get overwhelmed with respondents. I didn't think I would, because it's a pretty specific ask, But so I just did it through friendship networks and people I thought of that might be eligible. One of the people is one of my partners that answered. And through, it seemed like it got put out on some sort of list for trans masculine people in Boston. So I got a couple of people through that, but actually it was pretty geographically, it was a little heavy Northeast, but so people just came to me. I asked people, people didn't flake out. Everyone was very chatty, very happy to talk about it. And I asked people if they would be interested. I said I would be limited to an hour, so I did keep to that. And I asked if people would be interested in doing more of a sort of like life story, longer approach, which I had learned was like an oral history thing. And I said would be maybe 2-hour segments. Everyone said yes. So I did invite people. I thought it'd be interesting if they wanted to send in imagery that was meaningful to them from cruising where they went or clothing. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, maybe, I don't know. And then no one sent me anything. So
Methodology. So JD, I was my advisor, Annie Ball. There's a relationship of oral history to queer history. These things are in relation to each other. As Annie has written about Mark Stein's work on the subject. And so the approach of oral history would be ideal for my project. But I don't like talking to people. And so this is maybe why I'm studying history, right? We're supposed to be stuck in archives. And so, or at least it's painful. I mean, I shouldn't say I don't enjoy it, but it's painful and I don't look forward to it. So, but gay community news, I've been so interested. It's like, it was an institution, it was like a newspaper, right? So sometimes when it's been written about, through media studies, right? It was also a community of people. The approach of oral history would be ideal to exploring the community news as a community of queers, and I'm definitely interested in that. But I think in some ways I adopted this close reading approach because it's something I enjoy and I'm interested in, but also because it was a way of getting at the story without having to actually talk to people. And so I do, and I also think that at my interviews that I will conduct with folks and have begun will be much more productive the more situated I am in, it's the oral history is a process that I'm just beginning to come to terms with.
Can I say something briefly about that though? I just whispered to Robert that GCN owes me $50. And that's because when I was like a young queer and act up in the early 90s, when I was working on a gay paper, I did some writing for several publications that folded. And they folded because, I don't know all the reasons they folded, but a lot of it was because of AIDS and people were dying. So these publications were becoming dysfunctional or dying off, including the one I worked at. And so it's an interesting situation, limitation, that there's a survivor bias for the work that we may be doing at this point in oral histories of who survived and who didn't, so that's definitely something. HIV stuff like runs through all of my work and thinking, and because it just came up through it,
And turning into, it's Audrey, right? Just to say, sorry, and so many newspapers were dying at the
Yeah.
time because of landscape, but it's so interesting that zine culture was rising,
Yeah.
and I never thought about that, but.
Yeah, thank you for that transition.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is part of my dissertation work. My dissertation was more about just writing about, the neighborhood that I grew up in, Southeast LA. East LA is like very historicized, but there's whatever overlap. Anyways, I started, interviewing Rudy for my dissertation, and then he shared that he wanted to actually digitize all of his archives, like his personal archives. So it went from like a 2-hour interview to now over 30 hours with him, friends and family, and I've digitized over 2,000 images or like ephemera of like early 2000s, like right before the internet, right, MySpace, that switch of queer and punk LA. So it's been, yeah, that 2 hours is important, but yeah. So it's like, so this is like a really big project. Yeah.
It's amazing. I wonder, oh, yes, please. Oh, go. Whoever wants to go first.
Thank you all for your papers. I wanted to, JD, you talked a lot about people's perception of change over time. And so I wanted to take that idea and ask Robert and Audrey about that. When you think about the notion of queer class consciousness or mentorship, which I think are both really intriguing concepts. I was just struck listening to your papers about how much in my perception those things may be different today in people's experience or understanding, in part because of the different ways that we think about community or live in community. But I wonder how you think about the way those concepts might be different today.
Yeah, so yeah, there's like so much to think about, because I think part of the reason I feel like Rudy was able to develop these mentorships, it was just a different time. So you should just write to these people, go up to these people. And I feel like I feel like it's a different time in the sense of like with social media and sort of like that celebrity and like followers and like all that sort of like interest and energy towards that. I feel like it does change things, because I do think sometimes people feel a little bit more protective of like, if somebody reaches out to them, it's like, why are you reaching out to me? So and also lessons learned that when people have been generous in maybe taking people under their wing, that people do take advantage of that, right? So I think, yeah, it looks a little bit different, but what I will say is that Rudy continues to mentor like younger, queers. I feel like he mentors me in different ways that I don't think he knows. And I see him sort of like as a bridge, because we're talking about like generations, he's like Gen X, and so I'm not Gen X, I'm political. So, so I kind of feel like he does that work of sort of bridging. And so through him, I was then able to meet, people that are part of this post network. So, and not, like, not to like, oh, like, I got to meet them, that's so cool, but like, in terms of like connecting sort of like these different dots of like, just mentorship that's happening, that's intergenerational and queer and punk and Latino, like that's really,
It's just the it's funny with the question of change over time. One thing that I was thinking about was like I was looking at consistency over time. I'm looking to see like what are these relationships that were substantial enough to provide real motion and trajectory to the gay liberation movement. And so, JD, your discussion of The infrastructure, I've looked at, I've read Delaney, some of his novels, and I've looked at that book, but I haven't, the networking as next to contact.
Yeah.
I really like that. And so I'm very interested in my work, and it didn't make it, it's not in here, but around questions of urban space. And so I'm looking at one of my, I actually, at the Queer and Trans conference coming up in Ann Arbor, if anyone's gonna be there, I'm giving a paper on infrastructure and urban renewal. Queer liberation at the edge of urban renewal, I think is the, and it's so fascinating how these landscapes were torn out. And of course, the Disneyfication of Times Square is a famous example, but the Park Square is a neighborhood in Boston that I'm very interested in. And that, like, where all of these spaces of contact were, and then just to you get to like questions of individuality, self-sufficiency, right? Like, I'm just thinking, like, when everyone can be living. Yes, I'm sorry. Just like when the more expensive shit gets, the harder it is to form a community. Is
Absolutely.
short version.
Can we just get this one last question, because we only got a minute. Please go ahead.
Right. So I want to ask about your like idea that like trans men is, you know, like a stepping stone, like homosexuality. And I work on like trans history also, but I work from like an Asian American studies perspective. And from my understanding, that role actually used to belong to like cis gay, like Asian American men.
Yeah.
So, like, I want to ask, like, what's your opinion on like how did that change? Like, when did that change? Like, when did trans men like come to assume like that
Yeah.
position?
Yeah, and I don't know if that it has changed or maybe it's been added on, because I think the connection there is perceived femininity, right? So it's perceived as like a step that one person says a stepping stone, or, you know, there's like familiarity as well as queerness, you know, so that's why I don't know, you can tell me if perceptions have changed of like that sort of like, it's a form of fetishization, right, of like Asian men as that role, as trans men have become more that for some people, you know. But I think that's what it's based in, well.
Well, we're right on time, and I want to please thank our presenters. And have a great conference, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, I have a good idea, right?